Well, hello to everyone who is joining me today for this live. This is for Moon Books, who has been my publisher now since, I believe, 2012 or 2013. I probably should know this, but it all kind of blurs together after a while. But I've been writing for Moon for quite a while. I very much like them as a publisher, clearly, because I have quite a few books out through them. And I thought today, for all of you who have decided to join me in this, that we could talk a little bit about my next book that's coming out. It's called Pagan Portals, Living Fairy, Fairy Witchcraft and Star Worship. This one comes out, I believe it's 1st December. I think Amazon is always a little dodgy with when they actually release things and the actual publication dates. So it's either the end of this month or the very beginning of next month. This one is sort of a continuation of some of my other books on fairy witchcraft. And it is a bit of a deeper dive, I suppose we could say, compared to the last few I've done. The immediate predecessor to this one, Traveling the Fairy Path, is also a bit of a deeper look and a more personal look at my connection to this particular form of witchcraft, this particular path. So this one, sort of stepping off a little from there, is talking about sort of fairy witchcraft in a little more depth. When I talk about fairy witchcraft, because of course there's a couple different paths at this point that use that name or a similar name, I'm using it to refer to the specific form of witchcraft that I follow, which tends to focus primarily on the good neighbors or the good folk, what a lot of people would refer to as fairies. I probably should have said right as we started this live that anytime I'm discussing themselves and technologies involved, things can get a little dodgy with the technology. So if we have any weird lagging or freezes or anything like that, I apologize in advance. It tends to happen when this is the subject being discussed. But the first half of this book, it is a fairly slim book because it's a pagan portal. So it's meant to be sort of a shorter jump into the subject, as it were. Runs about 90 pages or so. The first half is really getting more specifically into my particular approach to fairy witchcraft, some aspects of it that have changed a little bit since I wrote the first Pagan Portals Fairy Witchcraft in 2013. I believe that one was. And talking a little more about what it means for someone who is a practicing witch to make this sort of deep connection, to sort of get into this type of practice, which is more particularly focused on the good neighbors. Because it is different from other types of witchcraft that are out there. My particular approach is different from other types of witchcraft that call themselves fairy witchcraft. I know it's very confusing, but I try to be clear that when I'm talking about fairy witchcraft, it's a particular sort of thing. And it's not necessarily what other people might be talking about when they use the same terminology. Usually you'll find that people who are approaching it differently, who have a different form of fairy witchcraft, have a different spelling for the word fairy. I go with the more sort of the one that's found commonly in academic works and folklore, but there's a couple spelling variations that are running around out there. So that can be one quick way to tell, but my particular approach, it has changed a little over the last 7 years. It's meant to be a living organic system. So, naturally things do change, things will change. For example, I talk a little in this about my current approach to casting circles, which is a practice that's found in a lot of systems of witchcraft. I've kind of shifted from the way that I was doing it 7 years ago when I wrote the first book. Not that there's anything wrong with that particular approach or that you can't use it if you've read the book and you like it, but I've just sort of changed my own approach to it. So I write a little about that in here and how I'm currently doing things. I talk a little bit about some particular things that have come to me through my practice, ways to cleanse, for example, certain things I use, offerings, that kind of thing. It's much more interesting than I'm making it sound, I promise. I also talk a little about just the organic nature of this practice. In the earlier books, I've talked about the liminal gods, who are sort of the main deities of this type of witchcraft, and how they sort of straddle the line between more traditional deities and fairy kings and fairy queens, and sort of, are they gods? Are they members of the fairy host? I don't know. And I don't think it particularly matters in the context of what I do, but as you are getting into this practice, if it interests you, if it's something that you want to do, you'll find that you make your own connections to these beings. And there is no really firm set pantheon the way that some other forms of witchcraft might have. So I talk a little in here about some some new liminal gods that I've kind of met along the way over the last 7 years, sort of who they are and how they fit into things. There's a reason that I titled the book Living Fairy, besides the fact that I really like wordplay quite a bit. Because, not only is it supposed to represent that fairy, the world of fairy and the beings within it are living and alive and present in our world, it's also sort of meant to be in that verb sense of living the practice, living the witchcraft. So sort of both angles to that. And I do talk in here a lot about how I feel that the good folk are coming back and becoming more present in the world today, that they're connecting more solidly with people, and that we, especially those of us who are drawn to work with them, need to appreciate that connection and do what we can to sort of nurture it. This was arguably, perhaps, their world before it was our world, and they have a place here. They were driven out across the last 1,000 or so years, and we're starting to see pushback from that with that. So I kind of get into some of my thoughts on that and the importance of re-enchanting and sort of rebalancing things, getting things back the way they used to be. Obviously, specifically in particular places, not globally. There's many other places around the world that have never sort of driven out their otherworldly spirits, and different things would apply there. The second half of the book, however, and again, keeping in mind this is a lot about the idea of this as a living, organic, growing spiritual practice, is talking about the idea of the good folk in connection to star worship, specifically of shifting one's practice away from a more lunar or solar alignment, where you would be sort of timing your holy days based on the sun or the moon, and into timing things instead by the stars, specifically in my case by the Pleiades, which is a particular constellation that I have found has a strong connection or resonance with some of these spirits. not all. Anytime we're talking about the good folk, you really can't ever make blanket statements that kind of apply to everybody and everything equally. There's always going to be exceptions, and there's a whole story behind how I started with this and made this connection, since y'all have been good enough to come here for the live and want to listen to me talk, or watching the recording and want to listen to me talk. Basically, I was in Iceland in 2018 with a group of people, and several of us, several of my friends, had decided to go out for sort of a late night walk, we'll say, this one particular night. And there was a lot of energy in the air, a lot of things were going on. The moon was supposed to be a first quarter moon. All of us saw it as a full moon. We actually have pictures of it as a full moon, which is, should not have been possible. Sort of our first clue that things were sort of maybe not as they were appearing to be. And we ended up kind of stumbling into this very intense otherworldly situation. All of us. This was a shared experience. And we had particularly noted my friend, Seo Helruna, who blogs and also has a book coming out, is a completely awesome person that you should check out. But my friend, Seo Helruna, who's with us, had noticed that the Pleiades were just on the horizon. And that felt enormously significant at the time. If you've never been to Iceland, or you've never been outside of more urban or suburban areas that have a lot of light pollution, the air is just shockingly clear. You can see the stars very vividly, in a way that you really can't when you have a lot of light pollution, a lot of cities or suburbs around you. So sitting on the horizon the way they were, the Pleiades literally looked like a little blue bonfire in the darkness. It was absolutely gorgeous. And there was all of this other, as I said, sort of otherworldly fairy activity going on. And we ended up coming to the conclusion, sort of discussing it slightly after the fact, that we may have kind of stumbled into a bit of a celebration on the otherworldly end of things. And thinking about it and talking about it, particularly with Seo Helruna, I had kind of come to the conclusion that the location of the Pleiades at this particular moment was really important, was sort of the thing that was being acknowledged or celebrated. And I did not know anything about this constellation beforehand. I'm not one of those people who had a strong interest in astrology or astronomy, for that matter. I had always sort of done things by the more casual, if the moon is full, if the moon is dark, equinoxes, solstices, fire festivals kind of stuff. And I kind of found myself over the next few days, as our trip in Iceland had continued, kind of going back in my mind and thinking a lot about this, about what was going on, meditating on it, that sort of thing. And when I got home afterwards, I started doing a lot of research, as I am prone to do. For those of you that are familiar with my work, research is kind of the foundation for me in how I understand and get a frame of reference for esoteric phenomena or otherworldly incidents, all of that. So I started doing some research, and I found out that actually the Pleiades are this hugely significant constellation to cultures globally. And I do mean that. It's not hyperbolic. I mean that, quite literally. The Maori in New Zealand, I apologize if I just mispronounced that, culture is very strongly connected with the Pleiades. times particular things, particularly the beginning of the new year, based on when the Pleiades are at certain points in the sky. I found out that historically, cultures like the Greeks would time when they would start sort of their spring, when the ships would start going out sailing, when they would plant, based on when the Pleiades were at a certain place in the sky. Even in North America, there are several indigenous tribal groups here that timed things, particularly planting, by this sort of pattern of this constellation. I also found out in digging through all this research that pretty much every culture that I could find information on anyway acknowledges this constellation. It has a name for them. And many, many cultures have a fairly similar mythology attached to them, describing them as being 7 women, usually sometimes sisters, not always. But the stories just seems to have this particular connection, even in diverse cultures that had no real contact with each other. I also found out that a lot of Neolithic sites, including, and again, I apologize because I may mispronounce this, Göbekli Tepe, which is a location in what's now modern day Turkey. It's one of the oldest, might actually be the oldest Neolithic stone circle. It dates back, I'm not going to remember this offhand, I believe it's about 10,000 years. As I said, it's the oldest. But sites like that are thought, speculated to have had alignments to the Pleiades, kind of like we now understand these Neolithic sites will have solar alignments, that at particular days of the year, the sun will line up in a certain way, shine on a certain stone, that kind of thing. They also have these constellation alignments where at a certain time of year, right on the horizon, this constellation would line up so you would see it if you stood and looked out this particular point. And we, as I said, we know that Göbekli Tepe has this. There's also several in Ireland that are speculated to have had this alignment, particularly historically. There is this thing that's called Constellation Drift, which I would be probably the worst person to try to explain, but effectively means that the stars, even though they have a set pattern that we see through the rotation of the Earth, that pattern shifts subtly over time, so that when we're talking about grand scales of time, thousands of years, it's less subtle of a shift. So, for example, the culmination of the Pleiades, which is the point where the constellation is directly overhead at midnight, is going to be around November 20th, 21st this year. It's generally around November 21st now, at this point in time, this set of years. However, 1,000 years ago, it would not have been. It would have been roughly 9 to 10 days earlier, I believe. At that point, it would have lined up with Samhain. So we have some references to the Pleiades being directly overhead on Samhain night about 1,000 years ago. It's a little complicated trying to figure out the timing issue because we did have the calendar change from Julian to Gregorian about 150 years ago, which moved everything back by about, I believe it's 11 days. So you kind of have to figure if 1,000 years ago it was October 31st, then you have to add 11 days to that to figure out what that actually would have been on the modern calendar, if that makes sense to everyone. But my point here is that over 1,000 years, the timing has changed by, a not insignificant amount of time. We have a lot of references, ancient historic references, to the timing of the Pleiades, as I said, in the spring in particular, being used to sort of indicate when spring was starting. And basically 3,000 years ago, 3,500 years ago, it would have worked out to about the same time as the spring equinox. The Pleiades would do something which is called, in technical speak, going conjunct with the sun, which means you could no longer see them in the sky. They were up during the day when the sun was up. And they would be invisible in the sky for 6 weeks until what was referred to as the heliacal rising, which is when they would appear on the horizon just before dawn. And then you would see them briefly before the sun came up. So that usually takes about 6 weeks that they're not seen. And these two dates are particularly significant dates across, again, in this wide variety of global cultures. And we know that 3,500 years ago, again, this lined up with roughly the spring equinox. And because of that 6-week time frame, roughly what we today would refer to as Beltane or Beltane. Now, that timing does not still work out today. Because of this constellation drift, what we find today is that the conjunction with the sun tends to happen around May 14th. So very close to what is sometimes referred to as the old calendar date of Beltane. And then roughly 6 weeks later, which is just a little bit before the summer solstice, we can see them in the sky again. We have that heliacal rising. So if you wanted to celebrate these dates, which is something I talk about in my book, you kind of have to understand that they're not the same as what they were historically. They have shifted. They've kind of moved. So clearly, cultures that would still be acknowledging them would not be continuing to celebrate them as the beginning of spring, because the date has shifted so significantly forward. You would sort of want to adjust what you were focusing on. And my point in kind of rambling all about this, in fairy witchcraft being this living organic practice, is I had kind of had this epiphany when all of this idea of stellar worship and timing things with constellations came to me, that perhaps that might make more sense in the context of beings like the good neighbors, the fairies, who live and exist on these grand time scales, sort of like the stars themselves. And that rather than timing things by the sun and the moon, timing things by the stars, which are more fixed in nature, I guess we could say, but also have this very slow pattern to them, would make sense. So this sort of became my new approach to celebrating holy days. I ended up completely revamping how I do that. And it has been an interesting challenge, because obviously celebrating by the stars, you are really disconnecting from that agricultural concept, which sort of permeates modern paganism, arguably perhaps historic paganism, so that instead of celebrating, the spring equinox as the beginning of spring, perhaps you would be celebrating when the Pleiades reach these particular points, the conjunction with the sun, the heliacal rising, the chronicle rising, which is what we had noted that September 2 years ago in Iceland, when they're just on the eastern horizon at just after sunset. There we go. And then the culmination, when they're directly overhead at midnight. These are points that are not tied to a cycle of agricultural growth or harvest, along the lines that a lot of pagan celebration calendars are, but they kind of have their own cycle to them. So I sort of been doing a lot of personal work spiritual work, however you want to phrase it, to dig into what that cycle would be, and particularly would be for me within this context of the fairy witchcraft that I practice. And I found connections between each of these dates and sort of a wider cycle or pattern with the good folk themselves, and sort of them shifting about. Obviously, that's all personal gnosis once we get into that. So the book includes a bit of my actual research, particularly about the history of the Pleiades connected to stellar worship and these different locations, and how they were significant historically. But then I also talk a lot about my own personal gnosis, about how they can be and are still significant today to me in my practice. And I worked out a set of rituals, 4 rituals to be done at these 4 particular points. I've been doing them now for a couple of years, and I've had other people doing them. I've been sharing them online. So I've had other people doing them with me, and we're definitely getting some very interesting results. One way or another, however you want to look at this, there definitely does seem to be something energetically to this. There's some connection with it. It's touching on something. It's connecting into something. So, and I do talk about all of that in here in a much more coherent fashion than I am talking about this right now. But it's been a huge shift for me. It's part of why I wanted to share it with people, was to put it out there for anyone who might be interested in it as well. And also just to show people that, we kind of get this idea, I think, with all traditions, and this is of course true for some of them, but with all traditions, that everything is fixed and set and sort of immutable. And at least with my approach to fairy witchcraft, that is not the case. Things are fairly flexible. Things change, things adjust over time. It's organic. It's meant to be a practice that is about connection to the other world, to the other crowd, to these beings. And so that's never going to be rigidly set. It's always going to be moving and shifting. Again, personal gnosis here, but the beings that I guess you would describe as like my guides, my familiar spirit, whatever you want to call them, has sort of compared this to like a dance. It's the dance of the stars, is the cycle of the Pleiades through the sky, and then the ritual cycle that goes with it is the steps of the dance for us here, trying to follow along with it. I found a lot of significance to it. For those of you that are not profoundly interested in practicing fairy witchcraft the way that I do, you might still find it interesting to read about and to see a different way of doing things. It's definitely not your typical neo-pagan witchcraft approach. But I think that's a good thing. Get some variety out there, different viewpoints, always positive. So that's about half an hour of me rambling just about this, which comes out soon. I did also have a book that came out recently, beginning of October, end of September. Like I said, Amazon is always dodgy about the actual dates that things are released. That was another Pagan Portals, Raven Goddess. That one is my second book about the Morrigan, who is an Irish goddess who is very close to my heart, if I may say so. Although my personal path, particularly since 2016, has shifted very decisively into the everything's about fairies kind of thing. The Morrigan still remains a goddess that I have a lot of respect for and a lot of passion about, particularly sharing information about her with people. So I had written a Pagan Portals about the Morrigan years ago, 2013, 2014, and I had always wanted to do a second one. I had gotten sidetracked with other projects. For those of you who are familiar with me, you know that I always have 4 or 5 projects going at any one time, and I just uh, hadn't been able to get around to it, quite frankly. But, recently, I finally did, and, I'm really happy with how it came out. It's the only time outside of the Fairy Witchcraft that I have ever done a follow-up book to one that I've written in the Pagan Portals series. And I wanted to write about, sort of the common misconceptions that we find with the Morrigan and the truth that we can find with her, um, to dig into, some of the, I don't wanna say more obscure, but, some of the mythological material that people might not be as closely familiar with. Um, and also to just, really give people a deeper look at who she is, and also to a degree who she isn't. Obviously, the gods, much like the fair folk, are living beings. They have independence, they have agency, they they do their own thing, and they do change and evolve and grow over time. But particularly with the Morrigan, I was finding that there was a lot of confusion, a lot of people who were seeking clear answers relating to aspects about her, or things about her, and just having a really hard time. Pardon me as my phone rings. Just having a really hard time getting any clarity, um, getting any clear answers. So I wanted to write something that would help sort of provide better information, clearer information, um, sort of a deeper dive. I think that's actually what I subtitled it. So that people who had that introduction, had that basic sort of knowledge, would have somewhere they could go from there. A way to sort of access the beginning of um, the more complicated material, I guess we would say. And also, maybe help people see ways to sort out and discern things that we actually do find in the Irish mythology from things that kind of get perpetuated from personal opinion, or even fiction. We have a lot of stuff that gets into sort of modern neo-paganism that is really rooted in modern fiction. And I'm not putting any judgment on that, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but I do think it's a thing that we need to be aware of and sort of be able to learn how to tell when something is coming from the mythology versus when it's coming from an author's imagination from 5 years ago. So when I wrote Pagan Portals Raven Goddess, this was sort of everything that I was thinking about when I was doing it. And I really hope that people find it to be helpful or entertaining at least. I think I have some retellings in there that I hope are entertaining. I wrote them to try to be a little bit entertaining. I also have a book coming out. I'm sure everyone's getting a little tired of me talking about books I have coming out, but Raven Goddess came out last month. I have this one coming out next month. And then the beginning of May in 2021, I have a book called Pagan Portals Lou coming out through Moon. And that one is about the Irish god Lugh, and discusses as well some of his pan-Celtic counterparts and cognates and connections. So I'm super excited about that one. I think that there's really not nearly enough out there on the market about Lugh. He's a really popular god. And I'm hopeful that we'll start seeing more material out there about him. The same as the book that I had done on the Dagda, where a lot of people are drawn to him. A lot of people like him. Finding information about him was extremely difficult. Getting a little easier now. So I'm hoping that Lou will sort of go the same way, that people will start putting out good information about him and writing more about him, because he deserves it. He's a really fascinating deity, and there's so much to him. I thought that I had a fairly good understanding of him just because I have a fairly good understanding of Irish mythology. But when I wrote the book about him and in researching aspects of it, I learned quite a lot. There's just so many layers to him, so much to him, and he really has sort of continued into modern folk belief in a way that you don't always see with all of the deities. People there are still stories about him, particularly in certain parts of Ireland. And there's just so much to him. He tends to get sort of painted into this corner of being the Irish sun god, when, don't want to disillusion people too badly, but he probably is not a sun god in the way that that classical sun god that people tend to imagine is. Not sure the Irish necessarily had that sort of a sun god, but that would be a whole other very long live discussion. But the stuff that he is connected to, and the things that he can be called on for, and sort of the way he appears in his stories, are so layered and so interesting, and just so much more than the way he often gets portrayed now. So I really enjoyed digging into that and learning the things that I learned writing the book. And I hope that when that one comes out, again, that people will find it helpful and educational, or at the least entertaining. We'll have to see. And let's see. Heather is commenting. She's saying she has just been reading Raven Goddess, found it fantastic at giving the original sources, especially as I have never equated herself to a goddess of sexuality. Thank you, Heather. Yeah, I do a lot with the original sources. As I've said in different interviews over the years in different places, I taught myself Old Irish so that I could read Old and Middle Irish, I should say, so that I could read the original myths, the original texts in the original languages, because I had found out, much to my annoyance, that in fact, a lot of what we have for translations are either heavily edited and missing big sections, or heavily edited and had portions added in. A lot of the translations that are out there are over 100 years old, and the translators at the time were a lot freer, shall we say, with how they handled translating. And I had noticed this when I was doing my first Morrigan book, actually, in comparing two different translations of one incident in the Cathmoitura, where the sort of famous, the Morrigan and the Dagda meet at the river encounter. And I noticed that between the two translations, there actually was a not insignificant difference. And just the nature of how my mind works. I looked into it and realized that it was because the translators, one of the two in that case in particular, had decided they would just add some bits, and they would just take some bits out. They were particularly known to remove anything that they thought, according to their own sort of moral standards, was inappropriate, overly sexual. So, for example, if you read the Stokes version of the Cathmoitura, that passage, he talks about the Morrigan washing herself in the river, which sort of elicits this, possibly sort of nice idea of this goddess bathing in this river. Um, the actual text, what it says specifically, is that she was washing her genitals, which is a very different sort of image. But because that was a little um, inappropriate by Victorian translator standards, that little bit was left out. But it's a fairly significant thing to leave out, in my opinion. So, again, I'm ranting slightly, but I feel very passionate about this. This is all what motivated me to learn the language myself, so that I could read the stories myself. So when I have done my more recent books, including Raven Goddess, I really went in and looked at the original material, not for the most part using someone else's translation, but doing my own, because I felt like it was really important to try to convey it as accurately as possible. I think particularly for a pagan audience, because we're basing our spirituality, we're basing our beliefs, practices, everything, in many cases on these stories, on these myths, on what we have preserved of these older beliefs. And when you're doing that based on a really sketchy translation, I think that is always going to cause people problems in the long run. I think, working from material that is more direct and more clear, maybe not as pretty, but conveying more of what the original said or was intending to say, for spiritual purposes, I think that that's a lot more valuable. Not to say that modern retellings and modern versions of stories aren't valuable too, because of course they are. There's a lot of people who work on that end of things. John O'Sullivan has a book of very sort of modernized stories that are out, that are fabulous. Definitely look into those. Laura O'Brien has also done work like that, has put stuff out that's more modern versions of stories. So there are people who are doing that. There are also, of course, modern storytellers in Ireland. Eddie Lenihan comes to mind, who keep the folk tales and that sort of thing alive. But I do think that we need to, not underestimate the power and the importance of the oldest versions of the stories, sort of the base material that we have that we're working from. And, the importance of looking at that in some cases. I think that we just have to understand that it is a living, changing, adapting belief system, but that it is rooted in something. It does come from somewhere. And Sean is saying there's a whole belief that Lugh became St. Colmcille too, which is a strange one. Yes. There's a lot of things with Lugh that are rather odd, no matter how you look at them. There's the idea, for example, that he's the father of Cuchulainn, but that he also is Cuchulainn, or Cuchulainn is Lugh, sort of reincarnated. Those two things are in the same story at the same time, even though they would seem to directly kind of contradict each other. It's in one of the birth tales of Cuchulainn. The idea that Lugh became Saint Colmcille is, to me, it definitely is a strange story, but to me, it also sort of reflects just the importance of Lugh, his significance, and this idea that people wanted to believe that he continued, that he remained, and that he had a connection to, potentially the new religion that was coming in. We see that sort of same thing with Brige, who, clearly a pagan goddess, clearly also a saint, Saint Brigid. Whether those two are the same or are different, we don't really know. But there certainly is the belief that the goddess Brige became the saint, or was incorporated into the saint. So that idea that people want to retain these deities, if we're even looking at them as deities, which is a whole other discussion we could get into. The fact that a lot of them became fairy kings or fairy queens. We see that with Finvara, who's said to be the Dagda's youngest son. We see that with Anya, with Cleona, Evel. Just the idea that they remain. No matter what else changes around them, they remain. Helen is saying, do you think that fairies have always played a key role in old traditions of witchcraft? Or is fairy witchcraft a tradition as shown by Isabel Gowdy? Because witches that work alongside the good neighbors practice, seem to practice a craft rooted in earth-based religions, but with a different outlook. Oh, there's so many lovely layers to that question. I do personally think that many of the older and early modern traditions of witchcraft probably did heavily involve fairies. And I do think Isabel Gowdy, if we credit that she actually was practicing witchcraft, because all of the Scottish witches who were accused, I think we sort of have to consider how much of their confession was genuine and how much of it might have had to do with the trial process itself. But since she confessed voluntarily, in particular, if we assume that the things that she was saying had a lot of truth to them, it certainly indicate that there was a practice connected to looking to the fair folk as sort of a source of knowledge, a source to practice from. And that is consistent in a wider sense with things that we see in a couple different cultures, Western European cultures. The idea that there were sort of, I hate to use these terms, sort of good witches and bad witches, and that the good witches in particular, although this did not save them in parts of Western Europe from still falling afoul of the witch trials, but in particular were learning their skill from the fairies, from the good folk, and that they were not the sort of dangerous, malicious people that we see in sort of other types of more diabolic European witchcraft. That they were usually cunning folk who did healing work. In Ireland, it's not unheard of for a Banfasa, a wise woman, what we call in English a fairy doctor, to have this connection to the fairies and have this practice sort of based on healing, particularly fixing issues that the good folk themselves had caused, breaking enchantments, bringing people back who had been taken by the good folk, working on livestock who were elf shot, that sort of thing. But these were all people who were also thought to have had a connection or ability to communicate or to have learned from the good folk. Isabel Gowdy is not the only witch in Scotland who said as much. There's another fairly well-known one named Andrew O'Mann, and he claimed to have had a strong connection to the Queen of Fairies, to have learned healing skills from her. There was another Scottish witch whose name I'm not going to remember offhand, but who said something similar, that he had been walking by a hill, fairy hill, and seen a doorway in it, and sort of been invited in by the good folk, who then taught him particular healing skills. And then there's several accounts by various women in the witch trials as well, that also sort of hinge on the idea that they were either learning from or in service to the fairies, particularly the Queen of the Fairies. And that was where they learned how to heal people, for the most part, is what they were doing. And then we sort of have the counterpart to that, which is the witches also connected to fairies, but who were known for things like inflicting elf shot on people, stealing milk from cows, butter witches, they're called in Ireland, and sort of causing assorted negative things to happen. So in both of those cases, we see that sort of deeper connection to the good folk. I don't think it was all witches in Western Europe. I think there were other things going on as well, but we certainly do have this kind of deeper connection to the good folk that we see happening, at least in a number of cases. The earth-based religion thing, I think, is kind of a separate subject to tackle. Most of the fair folk, most of the fairies in more traditional material and folklore, and even in modern living cultures, are not necessarily nature spirits per se, not the way we would understand nature spirits to be. They're not really earth-centered in that way. There's certainly a thread of that we find, but generally those are sort of a different approach to fairies. We see that in a different demographic and sort of rooted more in late 19th century and 20th century beliefs, kind of coming out of theosophy and then out of the Victorian reinterpretation of fairies. The more culturally rooted ones, kind of a very different sort of being. So in that sort of context, as a modern witch, if you want to connect to fairies from a more earth-based religious practice, then certainly that sort of more modern popular culture understanding of fairies would make sense with that. The more traditional, the older view, sort of debatable how earth-centered the good folk in that case would be. So I think that would be more of an open question, potentially a good long discussion or debate. But the wider question that was being raised is, yes, you do see this connection historically, at least for the period that we have evidence, which is really more the early modern period. So we have Emma Wilby talks about this in her book, Cunning Folk and Familiar Spirits. We have evidence of some witches who seem to have been connected to some sort of folkloric form of the Christian devil and demons and all of that sort of thing. But then we have this whole other strand that were very, very emphatic that they were not connected to the devil or to demons. They weren't doing anything that they even saw as being contradictory in a lot of cases to their Christian faith, but they were connected to the fair folk and loyal to the fairy queen and learning from the fairies, and that was where they were sort of basing their skills and their knowledge from. So it's an interesting subject to look into. And I should say Emma Wilby also has a really good book on Isabel Gowdy, if that's a subject that is of interest to anyone. Yeah. So I think we have covered a little bit of everything, and it is coming up on an hour. I don't want to keep everyone here for too long or bore everyone too horribly. I think I did really good restraining myself on the linguistics and not getting too ranty. I really appreciate everyone who turned out for this and hung in. Thank you all for the questions. I love it when people are interactive and I can kind of comment on things and answer whatever you happen to be wondering at the moment. And I appreciate everyone who's here, everyone who put up with the sound of my voice for almost an hour. And I will see everyone at some other point. I hope this was at least a little bit educational and hopefully a little bit entertaining, which is sort of my general goal in life. So everyone has a wonderful day or evening or night, wherever you happen to be. And look for the next Moonbooks Live whenever it happens. Bye, everybody.